Stand with me on the bank of the River Boyne, watching a king survey the crossing his army will force at dawn. He does not survive this moment unscathed. A Jacobite cannonball tears past close enough to graze his shoulder, drawing blood from the man who will lead roughly 37,000 soldiers across this water within a day, against an opposing army of some 23,000 waiting on the far bank. For one brief, chaotic moment, the entire war for two kingdoms nearly ends here, on this riverbank, before a single main formation has even crossed. What does it actually take for one river crossing to reshape two kingdoms and a continent-wide war at the same time? If you want the real, verified story of the battle that decided so much more than most people realize, subscribe now. There's more of exactly this waiting for you. The road to this riverbank begins 2 years earlier, in 1688, when England's Catholic King James II is deposed in what history remembers as the Glorious Revolution, replaced on the throne by his own Protestant son-in-law, William of Orange, ruling jointly with James's daughter Mary. James flees to France, but he does not simply accept exile. Ireland, with its majority Catholic population and its own long grievances against English rule, offers him a genuine chance to rally an army and fight his way back to power, and by 1689 he has landed there with French support behind him, determined to use Ireland as the staging ground for reclaiming everything he lost. William himself is not simply a foreign king imported to rule England for its own sake. He is the Dutch stadtholder, already the leading figure organizing European resistance to Louis XIV's expansion before he ever accepted the English crown, and the wider conflict historians call the 9 Years' War, a coalition of England, the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain and others against French power, is the actual continental struggle this entire Irish campaign sits inside. Securing his own throne in England and Ireland is not for William, separate from that larger war. It is a precondition for keeping England inside the coalition, holding Louis in check at all, which is exactly why a Jacobite victory in Ireland would have mattered to European politics far beyond these two islands. What actually assembles on both sides of this river the following summer complicates the simple story most people carry about this battle. William's army is a genuinely international coalition, English regiments serving alongside Dutch, Danish, German and Huguenot troops, reinforced further by recruits from Ulster. James's army, while predominantly Irish and Catholic, includes French soldiers sent directly by Louis XIV, whose own rivalry with William runs through the entire wider European war. This Irish campaign is actually a small piece of both armies, in other words, contain both Catholics and Protestants, a detail the later simplified sectarian memory of this battle tends to erase entirely. That complication runs even further than most people expect. When news of William's eventual victory here reaches Rome, Pope Alexander VIII, whose own political alliance sits firmly against Louis XIV's France rather than with James's cause, reportedly orders the bells of the Vatican rung in celebration. The Pope celebrating a Protestant king's victory over a Catholic one sounds, on its surface, like a contradiction invented centuries later to complicate a tidy story. It is not. It reflects the actual considerably messier politics of 1690, where this Irish battle is only one local flashpoint inside a much larger continental struggle to contain French power, a struggle in which the papacy and William of Orange found themselves, at least for this moment, on precisely the same side. If a Catholic pope celebrating a Protestant king's victory is the kind of complicated real history this channel exists to surface rather than smooth over, our members get more of exactly this kind of decision-by-decision breakdown, first and uncut. It's there whenever you want to go further with us. Now feel the tension building on both banks of this river the day before the crossing actually begins. You watch William personally ride along the riverbank to study the crossing his army will need to force, an inspection that very nearly costs him his life when that Jacobite cannonball strikes close enough to wound his shoulder, forcing his own officers to steady him rather than let the entire coalition army watch its own king nearly fall from his horse in full view of the enemy line. William recovers within the hour, dismisses the wound as minor, and continues personally directing preparations for the crossing rather than withdrawing to safety, a decision his own soldiers clearly register, given how much of this coalition's cohesion still depends on his personal leadership holding it together. If watching a king nearly die the day before the battle that would define his own reign interests you as much as it interests us, that same kind of decision-by-decision history is exactly what our members get first and uncut. On the morning of the 1st of July, William sends a strong detachment west along the river, a deliberate feint designed to convince James that the main Williamite assault will come from that direction, drawing Jacobite forces away from the crossing point William actually intends to force. James takes the bait, shifting troops to meet the perceived threat, and William's main force crosses at Oldbridge with considerably less resistance than a fully concentrated Jacobite defence might have offered. Now feel that crossing turn from a tactical manoeuvre into a real costly fight. You watch the Duke of Schomberg, William's veteran field commander, a soldier in his 80s who had already served multiple European crowns across a long career before this campaign, lead his own troops across the river ahead of William's main body. Jacobite cavalry meets that crossing with real close-quarters violence. Schomberg takes 2 glancing sword blows to the head before a close-range carbine shot to the back of the neck kills him almost instantly, one of the most experienced commanders in William's entire coalition falling in the chaotic melee around Oldbridge Ford before the wider battle has even fully developed. The fighting around the crossing itself remains genuinely contested for hours, William's numerical advantage gradually telling as more of his coalition forces force their way across, until James, watching his own smaller army increasingly pressed on ground he can no longer hold, orders a general withdrawal south toward Duleek rather than risk his entire force being destroyed outright. Before we return to that riverbank one last time, if this channel's telling of history, the honest kind that keeps the complicated politics alongside the clean battlefield narrative, is something you want to carry with you, our own merchandise is linked below. What actually happens to James's army in that retreat surprises anyone expecting a total Williamite rout. Casualties on both sides are, by the standards of this era's warfare, genuinely light. The Jacobites lose somewhere near 1,000 men, roughly 4% of their total force, while William's coalition loses around 500, closer to 1.5%. James's army escapes largely intact rather than being annihilated, a detail that matters enormously for what follows, because it means this single battle, for all its enormous symbolic weight, does not actually end the wider war in Ireland. James himself, however, does not stay to fight on with the army he still has. He rides for Dublin and then straight for Wexford on the coast, sailing back to France in permanent exile, never to set foot in either of his former kingdoms again, a king who survived his own decisive defeat only to abandon the war. His own remaining soldiers were still capable of continuing. His own Irish supporters do not forgive that departure. Whatever sound strategic reasoning his senior commanders offered for the hurried exit, the men James left behind brand him with a nickname that survives in Irish memory far longer than any battlefield honour could. Seamus and Chaca, James the Shit, a title reflecting genuine fury at a king who fled the fight while the army raised in his own name kept fighting without him. That remaining Jacobite resistance produces one of the genuinely great personal exploits of the entire war barely a month after the Boyne itself. Patrick Sarsfield, a Jacobite cavalry commander determined to keep the fight alive around besieged Limerick, learns that a massive Williamite siege train, some 150 wagons of cannon, powder and provisions, is moving toward the city with a light escort. On the night of the 10th of August, Sarsfield leads 500 hand-picked horsemen on a long night ride, crossing the River Shannon at an unguarded ford and falling on the sleeping convoy at Ballyneety completely by surprise. His men bury the captured cannon muzzle down in the earth, pack them with the convoy's own gunpowder, lay a fuse to the whole assembled magazine, and blow the entire siege train apart in a single explosion loud enough to be heard for miles. William's own siege of Limerick, badly delayed by the loss of the guns that raid destroyed, stalls for weeks, and Sarsfield's ride becomes the single most celebrated Jacobite feat of the entire war, a genuine tactical humiliation inflicted on the same king who had just won the Boyne itself. That remaining Jacobite resistance fights on for another full year after the Boyne, and the war's actual most militarily decisive engagement, the Battle of Argrim, does not come until July of the following year, 1691, a considerably bloodier fight that finally breaks organised Jacobite resistance in a way the Boyne itself never quite managed to. The war formally ends later that same year with the Treaty of Limerick, closing a conflict the Boyne is popularly remembered as deciding outright, even though the actual fighting continued for a full year afterward. That mismatch between popular memory and military reality extends even to the specific date people now associate with this battle. The Boyne was fought on the 1st of July, under the old Julian calendar Britain and Ireland still used in 1690. Aughrim, the war's genuinely more decisive battle, was fought on the 12th of July, that same old calendar, and for over a century afterward, Irish Protestant commemoration actually centred on Aughrim's anniversary rather than the Boyne's. Everything changes in 1752, when Britain finally adopts the Gregorian calendar already used across most of Europe, shifting every historical date forward by 11 days. The Boyne's 1st of July anniversary lands on the 12th under the new calendar, the same date Aughrim had always held under the old one, and when the Orange Order forms decades later in 1795, it chooses to centre its own commemorations on the Boyne specifically, in large part because William himself had personally been present there in a way he never was at Aughrim. The 12th of July that millions now associate specifically with this battle is, in other words, a genuine historical accident of calendar reform, layered on top of a deliberate later choice to honour the battle with the king in it, over the battle that actually broke Jacobite resistance for good. So think back to that riverbank at dawn, to a king nearly killed by a single cannonball the day before his own defining victory. You were never simply watching one clean battle between two clearly opposed sides. You were watching a genuinely international coalition war, fought by Catholics and Protestants on both banks of the same river, celebrated in Rome by the very Pope later sectarian memory would assume opposed it, decided by a feint and a costly crossing rather than total annihilation, and commemorated today on a date that only exists because of a calendar reform more than 60 years after the fighting actually ended. A king who won here still could not stop a single night raid at Ballyneety from humiliating him weeks later, and a king who lost here still left carrying a nickname his own supporters never let him forget. The Boyne did not end the war it is remembered for ending. It simply set in motion everything that followed, one riverbank, one wounded king, and one veteran commander's death, away from a considerably messier and more honest story than the version most people actually know. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the battles remembered for deciding wars they didn't actually decide, the popes and kings who ended up on sides the simple version of history forgets, the dates that only mean what they mean because of what happened decades afterward, there's another one waiting for you. Click it and walk with us further into